Okay, so everyone, welcome. I am Rabbi Howard of Congregation Emanu-El of Westchester. I'm going to ask everyone to please mute themselves, so I don't have to play mute police here. But if everyone can please mute themselves, so that you can, if you're at home, you can enjoy your dinner or your soda pop without all of us hearing you chewing and talking to one another. That would be great. Let's see, I'm going to mute Nancy here. Okay, Community Synagogue, are you with us? Community Synagogue. I know, right? I asked everyone to mute, and then I'm saying I'm mute. Okay, I'm going to go on faith that you're there. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker tonight, Muki Jankelowitz, who is the guide that Congregation Emanu-El of Westchester uses whenever we go to Israel. And he is incredible at explaining all things Israel, which is the point of this series. Once each month, we are going to get together to try to understand Israel and what it means to be an American Zionist. Muki is the best person to help us lay the foundation for this project. And once we have 2 sessions of introduction with Muki, we are going to go on to get perspective and understand the different kinds of Zionism that are available to us here in America, so that we can form each for ourselves a Zionism with integrity. So I'm going to stop there and pass things off to Muki, not only because he has more to say about it, but also because it's very odd to have my back to the people in the room and my front to the camera. So Muki, take it away.
Hi, good evening to everyone. Thank you, Rabbi, for the introduction. One thing you didn't mention is that I'm originally from South Africa. So for those that didn't know this, don't spend your time trying to work out what the accent I have. I'm originally from South Africa, and it's 2 a.m. here, and I'm delighted to be with you. What we're going to do this evening is talk about a little bit of the background to the Zionist movement in order to understand modern day Israel, and we'll take it from there. So in the slide, we can see the Magen David, the Star of David, which has come to be seen by many as a symbol of Zionism or a symbol of Israel, but of course was a symbol of Judaism, of Jews before that. And the second image that we can see is the person of Theodore Herzl. Theodore Herzl, who's often known as the father of modern Zionism. And he's the guy who, in many ways, creates the connection between the symbol and the word and reimagines what it's like to be Jewish. So we're going to be looking at Zionism a little bit theoretically at the beginning, so that afterwards, when we go into looking at Israel, we can understand what the state is. Put questions on the chat if you have them, or just note questions yourself, and we'll definitely have time towards the end to answer some questions. The map that you can see is one of many tens of possible. Everyone's seeing the what's up? The screen share? Okay. The map that you can see is one of many possible different maps of previous empires that were here, be it, as in this case, the empire of David and Solomon, or the kingdoms of various different kings that would come after them, the Maccabees, King Saul, whoever, or King Herod, whoever it happens to be. A sense that this land, with one or other border, was a land that Jewish people were connected to. And it's not just a sense. This was the land that the Jewish people were connected to, because, of course, we have archaeology that shows a very strong connection. The stone that you can see with the earliest mention of the house of David. Same David that appears in the Bible, archaeological proof of his existence. So there's long been a theoretical connection between the Jewish people and this country. But what has happened is, for the majority of that time, we were in exile. I choose the word, which is the historical word that we used. It didn't feel too much like exile growing up in Johannesburg, at least was not my experience as a young man. And I'm sure that for most of you, most of the time, it's not necessarily a sense that you're in exile. From the year 70, the status that the Jewish people had was the status of exile. And indeed, in Rome, they built the Arch of Titus to commemorate the destruction of Jerusalem. And if we look on an image which is frieze on the arch, we can see the enslaved Jews carrying out the menorah from the temple and going out of Jerusalem, going out into exile. The Jews felt themselves be in exile. Wherever they went, and the image that you can see is of the synagogue in Worms, in the heart of Ashkenaz in Germany. German-speaking Jews in Ashkenaz never ever identified as Germans, identified as Jews living in what would become Germany. Yiddish-speaking Jews in the Pale of Settlement in Poland, in the East, wherever they went, or Jews of Sfarad, never felt that they were part of a place. They were always Jews living in a place, living in exile. Again, this is not the modern way we understand things, but it's a very important building block to understand how Zionists would carry themselves forward, Zionism would develop. We were in exile. And this is borne out in the Jewish tradition, be it the fact that we sit around the Pesach Seder. If we make it to the end, we shout out next year in Jerusalem, and on the Yom Kippur fast. If we make it to the end of the fast, we shout next year in Jerusalem. Or at a wedding, where traditionally it was the role of the groom to break the glass, to commemorate the destruction of Jerusalem. Even at this happiest moment of our wedding, we remember that we were in exile. And that is the consciousness the Jews had as they walked around wherever they happened to be. So how do we get from this idea of next year in Jerusalem for 1800 years, 1900 years almost? It was a much more philosophical idea. It was a next year in Jerusalem. We're going to carry on living in Lithuania or in Poland or in Morocco. Something dramatic happens. The beginning of the story, if we were to stop a Jew anywhere in the world in 1750 and ask them, who are you? We would get the following answer. I'm a member of the people of Israel. I believe in the Torah of Israel. Because of our sins, we are in exile from the land of Israel. I hope to be worthy of the redemption of Israel. No Jew would have said, I am a religious Jew. No Jew would have said, I am a Zionist. No one would have broken up their religious identity into ultra-Orthodox or modern Orthodox or Reform or conservative. It was a four-part harmony. People, Torah, exile, and redemption. In Hebrew, Am Yisrael, Torah Yisrael, Eretz Yisrael, Geulat Yisrael. A four-part harmony, and it doesn't matter where you went in the Jewish world, Jews saw themselves as members of a people, believed in a Torah, who were in exile, and in present tense, because of our sins, we were in exile, waiting for Geula, waiting for redemption, for coming of the Messiah, which would include in it return to the land of Israel. The old joke that you stop two Jews today and you say, who are you? And you get a whole lot of different answers. And the idea is that something happened, something dramatic happened that disjoined the four different elements of that sentence. Those two dramatic events are what's called the Enlightenment. The man in the picture is Moses Mendelssohn, the father of the Enlightenment. And the Enlightenment was a moment that Jews were opened to learning to the languages of the countries in which they live. Moses Mendelssohn exposes Jews to the languages of the countries in which they live. In the middle of the 18th century, he translates the Bible into German, not because the Bible doesn't exist in German, but because the Jews who read it can now learn German. And so begins a process of Jews being enlightened into the world and beginning to become part of the nations amongst whom they've been living. The second event that will happen, dramatic event that will happen, is called the Emancipation. This happens a little bit later in response to the French Revolution. The French Revolution says all people are equal. It takes 3 years until that question is actually asked in Paris, the Council of Notables, who say all people are equal and Jews are people, or they actually said if all men are equal and Jews are men, what about the Jews? And the logic of the French Revolution is so powerful that eventually Jews are recognized as individuals. Now, I know as Americans, you have an emancipation of your own, and the concept of emancipation is one that's familiar with you, the emancipation of the slaves. Jews go from a status of no status to the status of an individual. In other words, were I to have been a European Jew before the emancipation, I don't exist as an individual. I pay tax to the Jewish community. The Jewish community pays tax for all the Jews. My personal status is governed by a whole lot of laws that are applicable to Jews, where I can live, where I can't live, what I can own, what I can't own, my freedom of movement, to name just some of them. After the emancipation, I have standing as an individual. I can go to university, I can go and live in a different area. These are two dramatic events. Because of these dramatic events, the Jewish people have a whole lot of options, have a whole lot of choices. And these are the choices of modernity. And without understanding this, we cannot understand Zionism, because before this, it was the four-part harmony. I'm a member of a nation who believes in a Torah, who is in exile from the land of Israel and is waiting for redemption. After this, Jews have choices. They can choose assimilation. I'm talking about assimilation as not someone who sort of gradually drifts away from Judaism, but Jews who do it as an intellectual choice. They say, up until now, I've been on the margins of society. Up until now, my options have been limited. And I am going to assimilate, actively assimilate into society. I'm going to take my children to the cathedral and get baptized. This is, in the early years of Western Europe, one of the biggest of the choices that Jews will make. Moses Mendelssohn, most of his grandchildren will no longer be Jewish because the walls have come down. They no longer need to be Jewish. There is another response. Oh, we got another two responses there. There is another response which is today called ultra Orthodoxy, these were the people who said, Revolt. We do not want to end up assimilating like those other Jews, so we're not going to change anything. We're going to halt right where we are. We're going to stop. They wear the clothes that they were wearing at the time the world started to change. We know David, Moses, or Rashi didn't dress like the ultra-Orthodox Jews do. They choose to dress this way. It's one example of the clock stops here. Assimilation and ultra-Orthodoxy are the two easiest of the ideas to understand, because assimilation said we're holding on to none of what we had beforehand. And ultra-Orthodoxy said we're not changing at all. But the third group, the group that said religion, is in many ways most similar to the group that will develop Zionism. Because the group that said religion go back to what it was like to be a Jew before modernity. They said, I am going to emphasize the Torah of Israel. I was a member of the people of Israel. I'm going to emphasize that Judaism is a religion. Why? Because I want to be assimilated into Europe, but I don't want to completely assimilate and give up everything. And so they will say to their neighbors, I am a Frenchman who worships in the Hebrew church. Because I'm just like you, my religion is different. The British expression is, I'm an Englishman of the Mosaic persuasion. Mosaic as in Moses. I'm an Englishman just like you, but I'm separated from you by being a member of a different religion. All of these responses are responses to modernity, because what these people have done is got rid of or de-emphasized the other legs of that four-part harmony. The fourth group, a group who said Judaism is a culture. We are a culture we actually are going to demand from the Polish government, succeed in getting at one point, cultural autonomy. We have our own schools in our own language, our own theaters, our own newspapers. We are a culture. We're not a religion. We are ethnos, a people from Israel. We speak Yiddish. We live here where we are as a separate cultural identity. And again, like religion, these are people who choose to focus on being a people in of all of those options before. We're not necessarily a religion, and we're certainly not connected to any land. The last group, the smallest of the group in the early years, was nationalism. It was a group of Jews who said, we are a people and we are connected to land. We are Am Yisrael and we are connected to Eretz Yisrael. These are all modern ideas of Judaism. They dismember the old four-part harmony and they say, we're going to be a nation. They look around Europe. Remember, European nationalism is very, very different to American nationalism, to post-colonial nationalism, because in Europe, if you live in France, you are ethnically French, unless you are one of the two minorities that live in France back then, which are the Jews and what was known at the time as the Gypsies. If you are Czech, then you are ethnically Czech with a shared history and a shared language, a shared culture, and Zionists will say Judaism is a nation. Like all around us in Europe, different groups are calling for, fighting for establishment of their own nation states. so we too need to begin to create our own nation state. Now, it's not clear, of course, how many of the Jews at the moment were deciding choose one or another based on, very often it was a lot of regional differentiation. There were different varieties of ideas. Essentially, people start making choices to be one other kind of Jew. There are some of the significant thinkers who will give voice to the beginning of Zionism. None of these people are yet called Zionists because there is not yet a word for this Jewish nationalism that is beginning to emerge. Indeed, the people in this picture, Rabbi Yehuda Elkalai, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Elisher, the first two rabbis that you can see, traditional looking rabbis, and the next person, Moses Hess, and the man on a lower level, Dr. Leo Pinsker. Rabbi Elkalai and Rabbi Kalisher are beginning to talk about something, but they're beginning to talk about something that is almost messianic, or that is messianic. They're getting ready. They haven't yet changed the paradigm, which says we're no longer waiting for the Messiah. We're going to do this ourselves. They're also no longer being entirely passive and waiting. Next year in Jerusalem, when will the Messiah come? When we're worthy, when we're suitable. Zionism will say, we're not waiting anymore. It's not next year in Jerusalem. Let's pack our bags and go. And Rabbi Elkalai and Rabbi Kalisher both write books, and we're talking about them writing books in the mid-1700s. And they are based on this very, very messianic idea, but it's coming back to Israel and it's a little more activist. Third guy, Moses Hess, writes a book in 1860. His book is called Rome and Jerusalem. It's not, it's a very significant name because there are two ancient peoples, the ancient Romans and the ancient Hebrews. What has just happened is the unification of Italy. Garibaldi, Italian people, which were a whole lot of principalities spread across Italy, have managed to shake off their slumbers, join together, and to create a modern country, which will be Italy, Rome. And he calls for Jerusalem to do the same, for another ancient people to throw off their slumbers, to pack their bags, and to come back. Hess is a collaborator of Marx and Engels. He's a radical communist, gives up on that idea, says, I want to create, the Jews need to create something uniquely Jewish. All three of these people, hardly anyone reads their books. Fourth person, Dr. Leo Pinsker, is a doctor, a medical doctor, who diagnoses that the Jews have a condition which they need to emancipate themselves. And he says we are victims of anti-Semitism, and as long as we are minorities living amongst other people, this anti-Semitism is going to be there, and we can auto-emancipate. We can do it ourselves. We can liberate ourselves from Zionism and from anti-Semitism by some kind of Zionism. Again, he doesn't yet have a word for it. None of these guys have a word for it. Pinsker already triggers a movement across Eastern Europe called Chovevei Zion, lovers of Zion, groups of people who gather in every city, every village, groups of people who would gather periodically to talk about, to discuss the land of Israel, who will try and buy a product from the land of Israel to celebrate one of their holidays, who will get ready, even begin to send a handful of people to the land of Israel. None of these people yet call what they're doing Zionism. That comes back to the people we saw before, and I'm rushing through a whole lot of heads, a whole lot of different thinkers, but it's very important. The term I like to use is Zionism is a soup. Each of these guys gives it a different flavor. The first person is Theodore Herzl. We saw him before. Herzl is born in Hungary, lives in, born in Austro-Hungary, which is an empire that straddles both what is modern-day Hungary and Austria. And it is a place in which people are struggling to identify themselves because nobody feels Austro-Hungarian. Either feel Austrian, or they feel Hungarian. And indeed, Herzl's family leaves Budapest and moves to Vienna. His family feels German. He wants to assimilate into Germany. He writes beautifully in Germany. He wants to be a playwright, not very successful as a playwright. He gets and becomes very successful as a journalist, is dispatched to Paris, where he will cover a trial of a Jewish colonel who is accused falsely of treason. And watching the trial, the audience are not shouting death to the traitor, they shout death to the Jew. And Herzl says, we cannot ever be part of Europe. We will always, even France, which is where the French Revolution happened, even France, which Jews were allowed to climb through the military and become colonel, at its core, Jews will never be accepted. He writes a pamphlet which is called Der Judenstaat. He doesn't write Hebrew, doesn't read Hebrew, Herzl. Writes a pamphlet called Der Judenstaat, State of the Jews. The state of the Jews is going to be describing this state the Jews are going to move to. And he creates a movement which has a congress in Basel and will have a fundraising arm and a publications arm. He travels from city to city, both speaking to local people and trying to recruit more members of the Zionist movement. And it is one of the people that he recruits who gives a name to this movement, which is Zionism. Zion, of course, being one of the names of Jerusalem, connecting very much back to that idea of next year in Jerusalem. At the same time as Herzl, at the same time as the Zionist movement starts to take shape, there is someone else called Achad Ha'am. His real name is Asher Ginsberg. His pen name is Achad Ha'am. Achad Ha'am means one of the people, one of the nation. Achad Ha'am writes in Hebrew. So he is very, very different to Herzl. Herzl is talking about a political vision, about negotiating with the Sultan and with the Tsar and with the kings and kaisers of Europe in order to negotiate a political state for the Jews. Achad Ha'am is talking about a place as a cultural focus. He's writing in Hebrew, we are going to create Mitzion Tetzei Torah. This is a line we sing when we take the Torah out of the ark. And he's saying we will be a cultural focal point for the Jewish people. Herzl is quite happy that the Jewish state would speak German, because German is the high language of Europe in his perspective. For Achad Ha'am, it's obvious that going back to the land would be going back to the source of the Jewish people. We're not going to go into as much detail about each of these other people, but I am just going to mention here Borochov and Nachman Sirkin. They are the fathers of what we call labor Zionism. And we'll see in the next part of what we'll talk about, the early Zionists were, many of them were very, very socialist in their view. These are central figures in labor Zionism, which is the dominant flavor of Zionism in the early years. Two others that you can see, Rabbi Kook and Zev Jabotinsky. Rabbi Kook will be the father of a stream in Zionism, a flavor in Zionism known as religious Zionism. If we go back to my model of the 5 different choices, Zionism was not, by definition, a religious choice. There were amongst the Zionists some people who were religious. In many ways, the people who become Zionists have to rebel against religion, because the old passive, next year in Jerusalem, we'll wait till the Messiah comes, is not something that we're looking for. Rabbi Kook, who will move to Israel as Achad Ha'am does, and as Jabotinsky we're coming to do, Rabbi Kook seeks to come to Israel, the land of Israel. Remember, the state of Israel does not yet exist, as an activist step in the bringing of the Messiah. He's different to those early rabbis. He says, yes, we need to pack our bags. We will no longer sit and wait passively for the coming of the Messiah. We're going to pack our bags and Jabotinsky, you can see, is wearing some sort of military-looking uniform, and Jabotinsky is the member of the mainstream Zionist movement until 1903. But he feels that the Zionist movement is not activist enough in trying to throw off the people that are controlling the land of Israel, and that we need to very much revise the passive nature of the Zionist movement. He will go on, for example, in World War I, to draw up a Jewish military unit that will fight on the side of the Allies against the Turks. And he hopes to use this military unit after the war as the core of a group that will go on to, in some ways, wrest control of this impending state that's coming into being. All of these last people that we've seen, the socialist Zionists, Rabbi Kook, Zev Jabotinsky, are all people for whom modern-day Israeli political movements have descended. Labour Party descends from the first two. Likud, the party that till recently was the party of the government, it descends from Jabotinsky, and the religious in most coalitions, not the ultra-Orthodox, who are also playing a role in Israeli politics today, the modern Orthodox, who are descendants of Rabbi Kook. But if those were the thinkers, and for many Israelis, they are the street names that we have. People are not necessarily able to sit and articulate what the difference was between one and another until they get to their 12th grade high school exams, where you have to know that stuff. We're going to talk now about the practicalities. And the practicalities are, how does all these different themes and ideas get turned into building the state of Israel? First significant turning point is 1881. In 1881, we have what is called the first Aliyah. The word Aliyah may be familiar because we have an Aliyah to the Torah. I made Aliyah when I left South Africa and came to live in Israel. Aliyah simply means go up. And in 1881, we have some of the people inspired by those Chovevei Tzion movements that came out of those early ideas, Moses Hess and some of them, the early rabbis. The Chovevei Tzion begin, some of them, to move to Israel. There's no clearly articulated ideology. They're not yet Zionists. They're simply coming not to die in Israel, as Jews had been doing throughout the period of the exile. They're coming to live. And coming to live means they are going to buy some land. They're going to farm that land, and they're going to be productive. The man that you see in the picture is Rothschild, Baron Rothschild of the French branch of the Rothschild family, who will be a patron of this first Aliyah, both by supporting the early settlements, by helping them establish, he himself was in the wine industry, by helping them establish industry of producing wine, comes Carmel Winery. He will also buy additional pieces of land to allow new groups, both second generation of those that are here, but additional groups that are coming from Russia, from Romania, from different parts of Eastern Europe, are coming and establishing these small settlements. An important point, which I mentioned almost in passing here, but a very important point, especially when thinking of the American pioneering story, there is no concept manifest destiny. Every piece of land that one or other group will live on, starting in 1881 and going forward, is purchased before people move onto the land and settle that land. Judenstadt, Herzl's book, The Next Turning Point, is only written in 1896. So we can see that that is 14 years of small groups coming here and settling here. In 1897, the first Zionist Congress is held in Basel, in neutral Switzerland, because that was the only place it could be held. And now there is a name for the movement. Now there is a vision for the movement. Young Jews all across primarily Europe, there are already also young Jews in the Zionist movement in the various new communities, be that the United States or South Africa or Australia or South America. And people begin to talk, not of going to live in the land of Israel and fulfill the mitzvah of living there and working the land like the people of the first Aliyah, but they already begin to talk about building a state. And we have, from 1903 to 1914, a new wave of immigrants called the second Aliyah. The people on the first Aliyah had not called themselves the first Aliyah, but the people on the second Aliyah realized there were people who'd come before them. And these are very much the founding fathers and mothers. They, the people who will translate all of those ideas that we'd seen in those many different writers had written about, they will translate it into practicality. They are the pioneers who insist on speaking Hebrew. The first wave of immigrants had mostly spoken Romanian, Russian, Yiddish, French. This group of pioneers say, taking a page from the pages of European nationalism, what differentiates Serbian from a Bosnian? What differentiates an Austrian from a Hungarian? Your language was a central part of European nationalism. And these are people who demand speaking Hebrew as a basic building block of Zionist identity. And they have a logic which says we're having Jews coming from all different parts of the world, and we need to create a new language that we share amongst us. Now, I know that when I moved to Israel, learning Hebrew was a difficult job because at my bar mitzvah, I had learned to decipher Hebrew. I could follow the services in Hebrew. I couldn't speak Hebrew. For this generation, who followed and understood services. So the Hebrew that they spoke was archaic by today's standards, but was not quite as much of a challenge for them to learn Hebrew as it was for people today. But they learn Hebrew. And of course, they discover that language that has been confined to the study house for 2,000 years is missing a whole lot of words, which they will develop. In addition to Hebrew, they will develop agriculture. Remember, Jews
Muki,
had... Yes.
Yes. I want to pause you for a second and see if you. This is a great time, I think, to pause for a few questions, and I've got one to start us off, which is you've done an amazing job as always, sort of laying out the different ideological streams that led into this Zionist movement. But what might have motivated one of the people, let's say in that picture, to pick up from Europe and move to this malarial swamp in Israel? Can you give us a sense of like how this might have impacted an individual as opposed to sort of bottom up instead of the top down?
Sure. So as I said at the beginning, amongst those 5 choices, Zionism was the smallest choice, least numerical. Most of people that were leaving Eastern Europe in 1903 were going to America. Those that weren't going to America were going to South America or South Africa or Australia or even Western Europe. So important to understand there are push factors in Eastern Europe. There is anti-Semitism and pogroms, but there is also a very, very limited economic horizon. When I spoke about the Emancipation is a Western European phenomenon. In the East, Jews are still limited to the kinds of jobs they can do, to the areas in which they can live in. So there are people who are leaving, but who are the ones who are coming to the land of Israel? Who are the Zionists? These are generally very, very ideological people who are people who say, I'm not going to recreate the exile in New York or in Sydney. I am going to the land of Israel, and I'm going to build a new Jew. Now, New York, as you know, implicit in New York is it's new and improved over the old York, over what was before. The new Jew was critical of the old Jew who didn't do agriculture. Mostly they didn't do agriculture because Jews weren't allowed to own land. The Jews were never able to produce or were producing only a very limited amount of what they consumed. They didn't defend themselves, was dependent on the whims of the local potentially anti-Semitic Tsarist police force. And so these were people who said, I'm going to come to the land of Israel and I'm going to build a new Jew. Speaks my own language, defends myself, produces my own produce. Because if I want to be a normal person, they've read Herzl. So they're not saying anti-Semitism is just a product of Eastern Europe. They say even in liberal France and potentially in liberal America, anti-Semitism is there. I will never be accepted as an equal in these other places, so I'm going to be equal by playing the game according to the same rules, which is to create my own nation state. Now, we look at the picture, you'll see the picture is overwhelmingly male. Would have looked at the immigrants on the Lower East Side of New York, would have been overwhelmingly male. Young men would go, and later on, brides or sisters or orphan women who didn't have parents stopping them would join them.
Hey, Muki, it's Rabbi Groper. Can I jump in with a question?
Sure.
So you show these wonderful pictures of the Second Aliyah and pioneers, and this was around the same time of these huge waves of immigration to the United States, where most of our relatives, ended up, right? Our probably great grandparents, some cases with these teens here, maybe even your great great grandparents. And the numbers that came here were astounding, and the numbers that to Israel were so much smaller. Could you speak a little bit to like what was going on there? I mean, if you have this sense of nationalism and trying to be an own people and things like that, why did so many Jews come to America instead of going to Israel? Or instead of not even Israel, instead of to this land that, Palestine or whatever we were calling it.
So that you're talking about something like on the ratio of 1,020,000. The number of people who come on the second Aliyah, stay on the second Aliyah, is estimated to be about 20,000. Prior to them, or probably 3 times that number came, and 2/3 of them packed their bags and didn't stay, because conditions are so harsh with malaria and with not enough work on the land, and those who have work, it's backbreaking work under very, very difficult conditions through which they had not been used to. This is the swimming against the current. Zionism is not, when I was going through the 5 choices, I said this is the smallest, the least popular of the choice. The people who come are very, very ideological. They reject diaspora as an idea. They don't use the word diaspora. They use the word galut, exile. They reject the exile. We're not going to exile. We're going to go to the land of Israel. And the last Aliyah went until 1914. Stops in 1914 because a war stops it, not because there was any change in the desire of Jews to come. And indeed, the second the war is over, 1917. Now, if you know your World War I history, we know the war doesn't end yet. But the war ends in Russia in 1917 because after the Russian Revolution, the Russians pull out of the war, and most of the Jews are living in the area of the Russian Empire. They pack their bags and they start coming. And these people have just seen a successful, in their minds and at that time, a successful Russian socialist revolution. And so they're coming here to build a state that is not only going to be Jewish, but from the get-go, it's going to be socialist. It's going to respect workers' rights. Today, many of us have a political identity. We're a Democrat, or we belong to this or that political party here in Israel. In America, the ideology of the political party that you belong to was not central idea of what governed you. But for many of the people who come to the land of Israel, the idea that they are coming to return home to their homeland and to build it into a new society is dramatic. Third Aliyah, radical communist or radical socialist Zionists, they will face a new reality because now, for the first time after 1917, the area will be governed by the British. And in fact, the image that you see is Herbert Samuel. Herbert Samuel is the first British High Commissioner who is appointed by the British to govern the country, and viewed by the Jews as almost Messianic age, because he's Jewish. He's a British Jew appointed to rule this area. It seems to them that perhaps the Zionist dream is coming true. I will remind you that most of the Jews of the world are still going to America because as hard as the conditions may have been on the Lower East Side, they were a lot more amenable than the conditions were in the land of Israel. In 1920, America will change the law. My family went to South Africa because in 1920, America had put quotas on that couldn't allow my grandfather to join his one uncle in New York father's brother. So he went to his mother's brother in South Africa. The Jews kept leaving. They just went more now after 1920 to South America or South Africa or Australia. They didn't come to the land of Israel, even though the possibility of coming to the land of Israel was still there. Fourth Aliyah was a group of middle-class Poles, and they went, and they are the people who moved not to the kibbutzim, not to the settlements to be that kind of pioneer. They moved to Tel Aviv, to the cities. They leave Europe because they leave Poland very specifically because Poland imposes new tax rules that are directed against the Jews, that make life very difficult for the Jews and middle-class Jews aspiring to be businessmen, small businessmen, pack their bags, they come here. And I'm racing to get to the fifth Aliyah. Because after the fourth Aliyah in 1924, there is hardly any Aliyah for the next decade.
And just to be clear, while he's taking a drink, Aliyah is a wave of immigration.
Right. In this, right. I said Aliyah is coming up to live in the land, but in this context, first Aliyah, the second Aliyah, the first wave, the second wave, the third wave, the fourth wave, and then we get to the fifth wave. The fifth wave of Aliyah is the Jews who come from Germany. Jews who come after Hitler's rise to power. Numerically, we're talking about 60, 70,000 people coming a year. Remember, in the whole of the second wave, we're talking 20,000. This is numerically a very large group. This is a group of people who identity-wise, until very short while before, saw themselves as German. German Jews, unlike the Jews of Eastern Europe, who had never felt Russian or Ukrainian or Polish, German Jews felt German. German Jews were integrated. Then along came threat. And this is another important piece of the Zionist story. There were people who came here, a small number of people who came here inspired by an ideology. For many people, the idea of a refuge, a place where we can come and live, was played out by the German Jews. In fact, the sign that you can see is a sign offered by one of the youth groups to teach people aged 10 to 18, Germans aged 10 to 18, how to speak Hebrew. German Jews were not, unlike the Jews of Eastern Europe, many of the German Jews knew no Hebrew. They weren't religious. They came here because it was a place of refuge. So we have the ideological piece. We also have the idea that the state can be a place of refuge. I want to talk about two other points. We don't have a lot of time, and I did promise questions. The Arab response. Throughout the period of the Jewish immigration to the land of Israel, they are purchasing land, they are building settlements, and in general, they are providing employment, and relations between Jews and Arabs are by and large, there is unevenness to the relationship, but by and large, the Arabs are benefiting from the Jewish arrival, and relations are fairly good. This will change dramatically with the arrival of the Germans. Because when the Germans arrive, we have, in a period of 3 years, 180,000 people coming to the land of Israel. And the German, and the wave of numbers, many Arabs all of a sudden say, wait, the Jews are going to take away the whole land. And they come out in a revolt, which is called the Arab Revolt of 1936. And the British, as a result of this revolt will establish a commission, which is called the Peel Commission, which will decide to partition land. Now, the fact is that in 1921, they had already partitioned the land into Palestine and Transjordan. Now they realize that within what is called Palestine, there are two peoples, and that both peoples have, from the British perspective, a legitimate claim to the land. And so they're going to divide them up. And so this is the first map that you can see of what will be the Jewish state, what will be the Arab state, and what will be the area that will remain under British control. And from here onwards, relations will deteriorate. And we'll talk about that a lot more in the next session. As an end point, before I take any questions, let's say that in the 29th of November 1947, which is crucially after the end of World War II, Britain have said, we no longer wish to govern this area. We will hand this area back to the United Nations, and the United Nations votes to partition the country into three. The blue-colored area will be the Jewish state, the apricot-colored area will be the Arab state, and the white blob, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, will be a corpus separatum, an international city governed by the world powers. That is the map that the United Nations votes yes on, dividing the country into two. It's a very problematic map because it depends on goodwill to cross from one Arab area to another or from one Jewish area to another at these narrow points. But this is the map. And from the perspective of Zionism, a movement, this is 50 years after the first Zionist Congress. Remarkable success in coming to that stage where a state is to be declared. So I covered a lot of material. So I'm going to stop the share, and I'm happy to take any questions that people may have, or any comments, and also from the rabbis.
One thing that I want to point out that I think is lost on a lot of people is that all this groundwork that you describe, almost all of it happened before World War II. And very often we hear people say that Israel is a result of the Holocaust. And I think it's so important to understand that Zionism has roots that run much deeper than the tragedy of the Jews in Europe in the 20th century.
Absolutely, the roots run much deeper. In fact, the Zionist reading is that all those cadres of people that were packing their bags and ready to come here instead fell fighting in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising or wherever else. That Zionism was nearly derailed by the Holocaust. And also, of course, we look around, most the countries that were under colonial rule get independence between the 40s and the 60s. None of the others needed a Holocaust in order to get their independence. So the groundwork was set, the groundwork, as you say, was set beforehand.
Okay, I know that the students from Community Synagogue are bouncing in 2 minutes. So anyone from the Community Synagogue room down there have a question you want to ask before you have to head out? Yes, no? You're muted down there, so if you're asking a question, I can't hear you. No? Okay. Any questions in here? Okay. Did you have a question? You're pointing someone with a question. Okay. Anyone out there in Zoom land with a question for Muki? We covered a huge amount of material. No? Yeah, go ahead, Jane. Oh, did you have a question? Community, you just unmuted. Do you have a question down there?
No, we don't. We're actually just talking to our teens and wrapping up with them. But Muki, I want to just say thank you, first of all, for staying up late. Can you guys all wave at Muki? It's 3 o'clock in the morning there. Thank you so much. And maybe one year you go to Israel and he'll guide you around there. I love your background. I miss it. I miss you. And
My pleasure.
We'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
Bye.
Okay. Thanks, Daniel. Okay, Jane, you had a question?
One interesting comment from my viewpoint is how the British.
Jane, come over here and make your comment.
Okay.
That's okay.
So the British.
Sit right there.
So the British having control, making promises to the Jews and to the Arabs. I think a lot of the division that we see that percolates from early 1900s until 1947 were part of that vacuum, because here they're giving us, oh, we're going to promise the Jews this, and then they turn around and make another deal for oil with the Arabs. And I think that a lot of the divisiveness and tension comes because of that mandate of the British.
So wherever the colonial powers were, whether we look at India, Pakistan, and what happens there, or all across Africa, or where we are, the colonial powers have a divide and rule idea of how they're going to rule the area, and they certainly stir up some of the tensions wherever they are by that style of leadership. I absolutely, we didn't kind of focus on the mandate, but for example, in 1917, they issued the Balfour Declaration to the Jews and the McMahon-Hussein correspondence to the Arabs, telling us one thing and telling them something else. So absolutely, that's part of it. Now, I spoke about Zionism amongst the Jews, but important to remember that I didn't talk about the Palestinians. I spoke about a place called Palestine. I didn't talk about the Palestinians because they were still called the Arabs. The breakdown of Arab identities into different identities, a Syrian identity or a Lebanese identity, these are very recent phenomenon. In fact, if we spoke about Europe being nation states, most of the Arab world are state nations. In other words, colonial power drew a line, declared a state, and then the identity of those people emerged from their state, exactly the reverse of the European identity, where the Czechs said, we want our piece of land to be Czech. Now, that doesn't diminish the challenge that we have, that there are two groups of people who live here, and there are two different claims on the land. But the role of the colonial powers in defining everyone except Iran, Turkey, Egypt, and Israel, which are countries that have different route to statehood. All of the rest of the Arab world, all of North Africa, and the Levant are products of colonialism in one way or another.
Hey,
The questions. There's a written question.
Speak up. Muki, can you speak to the closed door policy during World War II? And we know there were many Jews not able to go to other places. Is there a huge wave of immigration from Germany and Eastern Europe that couldn't go to the United States, that came to Israel by default?
So the wave of Germans from 1933 to 1936 are Germans who wanted to get out of Germany, and that's where they could go to. There were Jews who went to China. There were a trickle into every possible country, but overwhelmingly they came here because they wanted to leave Germany. It was a different kind of immigration. The question is, why does it stop in 1936? Because the Nazis were still in power, the conditions were getting worse. And the answer is that the gate gets closed. You cannot come into the land of Israel. The British will shut the door, and what begins is a period that we call the illegal immigration. It's not illegal from our perspective, it's illegal from the British perspective, and it's a trickle because you can only smuggle a much smaller number of people in who could come in even as refugees. So the Allies will, again, a war, apropos the question I had before, the war is coming, there's no desire to, and we need, the British think they need their oil supplies, they don't want to antagonize the Arabs. Let's shut immigration. So there are Jews that are trapped in Europe, in Germany, and certainly further to the east, who are unable to come to the land of Israel. And I have a friend, on the other hand, whose grandmother was married 4 or 5 times. You know, those people trying to get green cards in America that do the same thing, that have these fictional marriages. She was constantly marrying people briefly, so that they could become citizens, because the Jews who got here were still vulnerable. The British could deport them, even with whatever else was going on at the time. And we'll touch on that a little bit at the start of our next session. The next session will be more based on the war, on the conflict.
Okay, Stephanie had a question in the chat. The first one I understand, the second one I don't. So can you open that up, Muki, and take a look?
What were the factors that made the Enlightenment take off amongst the Jews? Okay, I haven't watched the TV. I haven't watched the TV, so I can't answer the second question. But the first question about the Enlightenment, that Jews, remember, are literate for centuries when most of Europe not literate. Most Jewish men and a significant number of Jewish women in Europe are literate. They're not literate in the language of the country which they live. They can read Hebrew, Aramaic, and Yiddish, which are all written in the same script. They can't read Polish or German or French. Moses Mendelssohn, when he brings the Enlightenment, it doesn't take off in the East. It takes off in Germany. It takes off in the Western countries, where the Jews look around at their neighbors. And for the first time in Eastern Europe, there was nothing to aspire to these illiterate peasants. But in Western Europe, certainly in urban Western Europe, there is now an academic elite coming out of the universities. There are people who speak many languages, who know history, who know sciences, and just look around and some of them want to be part of that. Very much the Enlightenment is very much a Western European phenomenon. It spreads east much more slowly, and it was very much one adopts a culture, any other culture, when you think that there's something good about what you're adopting. If you don't think there's anything valuable in it, you look down on that culture, or you certainly don't adopt it. The Jews saw their identity superior, their literacy, people of the book idea. It was challenged by what they start seeing what they start seeing in Germany, and that was at least part of what made Jews interested in this. There is also economic opportunity, because once you are literate in those languages and you are able to start doing other things other than those very particular roles that Jews had been confined to, those merchant roles, those money changer roles that Jews had been confined to. Yes, Moses Mendelssohn wanted to teach German. He would have written it in German letters. It wouldn't have helped, because people couldn't read German letters. The whole innovation was the fact that they could By the way, was the way Yiddish was written. It was to use Hebrew letters. There was
Wonderful.
a comment that came in as well.
Okay, so Muki, I want to thank you so much. I know that next session you're going to cover the Israeli-Arab conflict and sort of how that develops out of the Zionism that you've laid the groundwork for us for today. And that once we've really delved into these origins of Zionism, and next time an overview of the conflict with the Arabs, that's going to really set the stage perfectly for us considering Zionism today and what does it mean to be an American Zionist today. So Muki, thank you so much for waking up. And I think we'll all say to you now, Lila Tov, you can go back to bed in the middle of the night. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
My pleasure. There were a number of familiar faces that I didn't get to say hi to. So I'm saying a collective hi to you all, and hopefully I look forward to seeing you next session. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.